folks. Okay, folks, we're going to get started. I usually don't need a mic because I'm yelling at people all the time. But welcome to our first talk of the 2024-25 season for the New Brunswick Historical Society. And our speaker must have a big family, right? They keep coming in. Come on in, come on in. So I'm Greg Marquis, Troy Middleton here. We have a few members, at least one member of our board here. So we run Loyalist House in the summer and fall. We're always looking for volunteers. We're always looking for money. We have a few books for sale hereafter. You'd like to look at some books in local history, and we have a small donation mug, and we have a couple pamphlets of Loyalist House. So we are having another talk, Troy, on the 18th? 16th?
16th of October?
Yeah.
And it's there'll be a presentation on war brides.
Yeah.
Melinda Jarrett.
Melinda Jarrett. So usually we go a bit later in the month, but it's the 16th. So watch Facebook, listen to CBC, and in late November we have a gentleman speaking on his new book on the McNair years, political history of New Brunswick in the 1950s. So watch those spots. Next Saturday we have a yard sale at Loyalist House from 9 to 1. We may have some reenactors present as well, so we may watch for Facebook and CBC. We may have a open house from 9 to 1, donations accepted, and we're selling off all the contents of Loyalist House to make some money. We just have to clarify that it's things that have been donated from the public. Okay, so 9 to 1 next Saturday. So I'm going to welcome Amber Creamer. She has a very interesting sounding book. I grew up on the West Side with a lot of sort of scary stories about what was called the provincial hospital. My great aunt worked there. But I'm really looking forward to this, and I'm going to let her introduce herself. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone for this great honor of presenting the book, and also to my many family members and friends, all the support. Thanks so much. Greg asked me to just speak about my background a little bit. I have been working with the Addictions and Mental Health Program. I just retired, but started in 2000. So, and I went back to school, and I'll get to that a little bit, but went back to school for a PhD in 2002. Started. It was a very long process, and a baby and some hospital stuff and all kinds of stuff, and it took me about 8.5 years, but I got it. And this book came out of some research I did way back then. Fast forward, beginning just shortly before COVID, and had to thought I should go back. My baby was much older then, and could spend some time working on it. So that's how the book came about. And initially it started out as just an article, but it just kept getting bigger. Anyways, so I'll just start. The objectives really were to review the lead up and the events that were involved in the Royal Commission. So there was a Royal Commission on the Provincial Hospital, as it was called then, in 1945. And it was quite a tumultuous time. It was during the war, so we'll talk about that, the effect of the war on the hospital, and review the results, the effects, what was the outcome of the Royal Commission. And then even looking at it moving forward all these years later, how the Royal Commission affected mental health care in New Brunswick today. And then some of the challenges I found trying to do this type of research. So a few considerations. I'm an amateur. I took two history courses, and researched looking at it from I worked as a nurse practitioner, from a nurse practitioner's eye. So that will certainly affect kind of how I see things in terms of healthcare and personalities and people and the way we look after folks. Presentism, I want to just mention that, things were looked at very differently 70 years ago compared to how we look at them today, and words were used that we would never use today, so they will come up in the talk, not too much, but things that or the way we look at things, how could somebody have said or done that, and now where today it would be horrendous, but back then it was part of the way people interacted. The language again, patient confidentiality didn't seem to be something that was well talked about very much back then. So there's a lot of very personal information, health information that made the newspapers. And the other thing is access to information. So I was very fortunate. I seem to have slid into doing this research when you could access the Telegraph Journal archives. And it's not, right now, even if you have a subscription, you can't access, the access, it's gone. So I was able to, it's amazing what you can find way back when. And now, unfortunately, it's not there. So it seemed to be a good time to do the book. So I was working, I did a history of politics and nursing course at the University of Alberta, where I was working on my PhD. And there were 2 sentences in, we had to write an essay. And I chose to do nursing at the old Centracare. And so I started way back, the initial annual reports, and went through them. The early ones especially were written by the superintendent. And I got to 1945, and there were 2 sentences in this big report. And here are the 2 sentences that kind of opened the door to what's this about? So the report on the affairs of the institution made by the Royal Commission shows the genesis of the attack and need not be discussed here, except to point out that such attacks are never productive of anything but harm. Doctors, nurses, and staff generally resent such incidents and feel that during present times, at least, they do not have to endure them. And I know that our staff difficulties during the past year have been increased at this occurrence. So that was kind of what is this all about? And I was really lucky because Andrea Cunningham, who was the librarian at the St. John Regional Hospital, where I had found, there was this box. There was a box kind of in the corner full of all the old annual reports. And so I had to start going through them. And I said, Andrea, what is this about, this Royal Commission? And within 2 seconds, she had it on the internet. And the report is available on the internet if you just put in Baxter, Royal Commission 1945. So it's quite an interesting story. So I'll just kind of start at the beginning and then maybe backtrack a little bit to talk about the hospital itself, just so you kind of get a sense of what this is about. So in 1944, 3 young attendants who were working at the old provincial hospital went to the Standard magazine in Montreal with terrible stories of abuse, neglect, vermin, deaths, and the magazine decided that they would pursue it. They had some legal documents drawn up, and then they sent an undercover reporter to the provincial hospital to work undercover and then write articles. So the 3 young reporters or 3 young attendants were Ernest Letney, and that's his picture there, I believe. It's kind of, there's always, is there another Ernest Letney in the world in 1945 that comes from Digby, Nova Scotia? So I'm pretty sure it's him. And then the other 2, it was hard to find pictures, Francis and Kenneth Hines. And I think Ernest was about 21, and Francis was about 20, and Kenneth was under 16, working at the hospital during that time. And this was Kenneth Johnstone. He was the reporter who worked undercover. He had worked for the CBC. He had done some work for them, as well as this magazine beforehand. So they called him back, would you go undercover? And the picture is actually from his daughter. Her name's Nahanni Johnstone. She was in Orange is the New Black, so kind of interesting connections there, eh? So Kenneth, the articles, I brought, actually I did bring some copies of his articles. I laminated them just to keep them solid and protect them a bit, but they really are terrible. They're written in kind of an easy to read style, very personable. You can really relate to the people in the stories, and they really do talk about abuse and neglect and all kinds of nasty stuff. So I can leave them, if somebody wants to look at them, I'll have them here. But this is one of his little excerpts from his articles. And this was so the articles were published in January 20th, 27th, and February 3rd of 1945. Turn your head this way, Ricky, said Kurt in a wheedling fashion, and tilted up the idiot's head invitingly. Ricky smiled at the unexpected attention. Dancing on his toes like a boxer, Kurt delivered a short right hook to the exposed jaw. I was aghast at this attack and turned to the other attendants to see what swift retribution would follow. They were laughing heartily. Marshall, Jeffries, and Phillips, those were the attendants. In the days that followed, the same performance was repeated over and over again by Kurt against his casually selected victim. I learned that Kurt was a specially privileged person. Never once did I see him so much as reprimanded for his brutal assaults against helpless idiots. So, and that's just one of several. So you can understand how shocking and how awful it was. And this magazine had a really wide coverage. It was, they even had it in they had the standard in the hospital canteen that patients could buy. So within days, the provincial government called a royal commission. And it's the whole point of the commission was to investigate the statements of the magazine, the management and operation of the provincial hospital, the conditions existing in the hospital, the conduct of the officials and persons employed, the care and treatment afforded the patients, and to make such findings and recommendations in regard to the premises as may appear proper and advisable. So just to backtrack a little bit and talk about the provincial hospital. It had been started uptown. It was the first in Canada. Harold Wright corrected me. It wasn't British North America, because Virginia actually had a psych hospital before we did here. And then, of course, they separated from the British North America. But it's the first in Canada, 1835, uptown. And then it was built. They decided they needed more because they needed more space. And they built over, they had several different sites in mind, including the one where it went to on Woolstock Park now. And it was built in 1848, and they, on 50 acres, unceded First Nation land. And it was back in the day where they thought that the environment was really helpful for mental health, and being near water was helpful, and in the country. So that was kind of kept in line with that. Ironically, another site that they had at the time in mind was the Ridgewood site, where the Centracare is today, but that was a site at the time, a potential site. And over the years, the property changed. At one point, during the 1945 commission, they actually had 350 to 400 acres cultivated. And they had cows, reportedly the best bull in Canada. And they had all kinds of plants that they grew, and they milk supplied the hospital. They had pigs. They were dressed at what was to become the annex site, which was built in 1870, and it was like a quiet place for patients to go. And they had several that worked on a farm, and so they had pigs that they looked after there, and then they were used for food for the hospital. So there was kind of a whole agency there. And it's this thought that, at one point they sold property, but they were back to quite large at the time of the commission. The superintendent was kind of the lord of all at this place. He had to make all the decisions about hiring and many, many things that today there are whole departments that address these issues, but back then it was the superintendent. And there was supposed to have been a board of commissioners initially, but at the time of the Royal Commission, I didn't see any talk about a board of commissioners. It seemed to be the reports went directly to the Minister of, I think it was Health and Social Services, kind of joined together. And there were lots of early issues, like right from the beginning, they reported that the male and the female groups were too close together, there wasn't enough water, there wasn't enough furniture or adequate furniture. The heat issues were there, heating the building. Lots of different issues, and they seem to haunt them through the years, these issues. And then again, there was language and culture. So we would have had, you know, lots of francophones that were there. At the time of the Royal Commission, there were about 350 francophones admitted to the hospital, but there was no guarantee they were going to get care in their language, or First Nation folks in the understanding of their culture. There was nothing like that.
So sorry.
Okay. So leading up from the beginning, and around 1934, there seemed to be a shift. And it might have been because a couple of things happened, or 2 or 3 things. One, Dr. Anglin was a superintendent at the time, and there was a court case against he and the deputy superintendent, or assistant superintendent. A patient, a woman, had fallen, broken her leg, but it hadn't been addressed. So the family went to court. Well, they were planning on going to court, but they didn't in the end. It settled outside of court. And I think it settled for about $1,500, which would have been a lot of money back then. But they were looking for, of course, the family. She must have been really disabled by that injury, because they were looking for a lot more. So it was kind of both doctors had the court case against them. Then there was an inspection done, which was really, I'll read this, but it was really quite shocking. So there was a lot going on. So Dr. Roberts was Dr. Roberts Hospital, but he was also the first Minister for Health in, I think, the Commonwealth. So they had a survey done of the hospital, and he wrote, he stood up in the legislature and said, "I hold in my hands a report of results of active investigations of conditions that have taken place in New Brunswick. These reports set forth in no unmistakable manner crime, immorality, and expense, and the examples of the 2 former such that even in this day are not what I feel should be read in public or appear in the press. They should have torn down or burned up the old buildings. The Black Hole of Calcutta would not be comparable to many of these old buildings. An accumulation of things both dead and alive for some 7 or 8 decades. The whole thing is nothing short of a tragedy." So there was it needed a lot of work. So they hired they were lucky, really quite lucky to get Dr. Menzies. He was from New Brunswick, East Scotch settlement on the Kingston Peninsula, had been a teacher, and then went to agricultural school, and then went into medicine, and had graduated and was working at the Verdun in Montreal as the assistant superintendent up there. So he was, they recruited him to New Brunswick to take on this. And he brought with him a nurse who I think was Lois Smith. It wasn't, they don't say specifically that she was the nurse, but she came at that time. And also another doctor. So he did write about what he thought the point of a hospital is. And it's to take care, which anybody who works in mental health knows, this would be overwhelming what he kind of saw. Take care of every social problem and other procedure too difficult for other agents to take care of. So that's kind of like everything and anything. To provide both physical and mental care, all specialty areas in medicine and surgical care that need to be represented in this hospital. And he described a different sets of patients. So one was the frank mental illness that he felt quite hopeful for, that they'd get better. He saw another group of patients as folks needing like senior care. A family couldn't cope with the needs of an older family member. Another group that he called degenerates, people of low moral standards who frequently got into trouble with police and were a nuisance in the community. Another group, some of the general hospitals had patients who were too difficult to care for. And I guess you kind of assume he meant in terms of their mental condition. And the other group was patients who don't have a frank mental illness, but were in such emotional turmoil that their families could not manage their needs. So you can see how it's really how would one building be able to look after if you don't have all of the support that you need. But he came and he was really ambitious and he did a lot of work. So there were a lot of changes made to the physical structure of the building. They did a lot of upgrading, fixing, painting, renovating, and a lot of it was done by the patients. The government was kind of off again, on again, what it was willing to pay for mental health, so he had to rely on what he could get from the government, because it all had to come with the money, but also how much patients could contribute. For example, there's a story of one person they had who was working, but he would only work on one side of the street. So he wouldn't cross the street to do anything on the other side of the street. So you had to work around that, and they had to get workers that were really good with folks that had their struggles. He made a lot of changes in the policies around the care. So people that could, they started opening the bathroom at night instead of having to use chamber pots. And some wards, like people that were on their way to go home, they would open the wards so, because they would work around the hospital, so they'd keep it open for them. So there were a lot of things. They used to have separate dining rooms on almost every unit, and then they made cafeterias. They had some cafeterias there built. He introduced new roles, so he brought in registered nurses, which were not, that was something new, and an occupational therapist. They brought in a lab tech because he set up a hospital unit, like a regular general medical hospital unit there. Hadn't been one before. And for 7 years, he got different specialists from the city to volunteer to come in and look after the patients. So gynecology, ear, nose, and throat, you know, breathing doctors, heart doctors, all to come in, surgeons volunteered for free to look after the patients. And then in terms of, he was quite like a leader in Canada because he did research. He was the first to introduce insulin treatment in Canada. So that was, it was giving folks insulin, which we don't do today. It's not safe. But research at the time, you know, has shown that at the time they thought it was really helpful because they found that folks that were treated with insulin might go into a coma, come out and be calm. And so for folks that were really aggressive and potentially violent, it was a way, they saw that as a way to try and affect that behavior. But you can imagine the risk looking at it from today's eyes. And he also introduced ECT treatment, which I don't know if anybody knows anything about it, but it's like an electrical restart of the brain, and it's been found to be very effective. Use it less, it's more selectively used today than it was in the beginning. And malaria was used to treat syphilis. So they didn't have antibiotics back then, and it might just take one encounter with somebody with syphilis that you would end up with the bacteria in your brain. And it may not show itself for decades, but it can be very, very devastating if folks died of it. So they introduced malaria, and malaria, we know what malaria is, but it causes fevers. So the fevers were high enough to kill the bacteria. And the treatment for it was cheap and easily, you know, they use other treatment to calm it down once it's killed the bacteria. But I mean, you had to, the earlier you got the treatment, the better. And some people, if they weren't treated early enough, could have defects in terms of brain function, and others could, you know, if you didn't get it early enough, it could progress and you could die from it. So in mental health care in the 1940s, so if you think about it today, the St. John Regional, I looked it up yesterday, has about 524 beds. So the provincial, I'm going to say Century Care sometimes, had almost 1,300 patients. And you had 3 doctors during the 1940s. You had 3 doctors and Dr. Menzies. So that's 4 doctors for 1,300 patients. And we'll look at the numbers of staff, but you can see how understaffed they were. And between 1939 and 1944, you know, when they were looking at the stats for the commission, there was a 15% increase in the number of patients at the hospital. Part of that was they had gone to 8-hour shifts in hospitals, so instead of working 12-hour shifts, you could work 8-hour shifts. They had the war was going on, so people were getting jobs in factories, and their seniors and family members needed somebody to look after them, so they didn't have it when they came there. Yeah. So when he went into the hospital, Dr. Menzies started doing x-rays on folks, found that there were about 350 to 400 patients with TB. That was more than the patients at the TB hospital. So that was a significant issue that he had to manage, and they had to be kept at the hospital, isolated. So you didn't know like what the different diagnoses on one floor where you're putting all these folks. We talked about the syphilis care. Medications, there were not a lot of medications that we have today. And the one that was used mostly was a combination of like a morphine type product with hyoscine, which would be a sedating for folks. And it was supposed to be very strictly controlled who got it, recorded very strictly, but it wasn't always done that way, and we'll talk about that a bit. And then they had physical restraints. So people talk about the straitjacket. They didn't really have a straitjacket at Central Care, the provincial. They had, it was more, instead of having arms in, it would be like your arms were, and you had like a completely around you. The name of it slips my mind, but it would be like you were just wrapped in cotton and tied in. And then people were sometimes restrained at the hands and the feet. And they called them sometimes hobbles, because if you were restrained at the feet, they were like a lock that you would have leather straps around your legs and then at your ankles, and then a lock. And that would be as wide as you had to move around. And that would be somebody at risk for running away or causing some trouble. We talked about insulin shock therapy and ECT. Hydrotherapy was, they had a unit where they had to set up, so it's water. And in some places, people would sit in baths, maybe for the day. Nice warm water, they'd be fed there, and it was supposed to be very calming to help folks, you know, relax and settle, or if there were behaviors that were amenable to that kind of treatment. They also had cold packs, where you would have cold packs wrapped around you, which is hard to believe, you know, would have been comfortable at all. And sometimes these treatments could go on for a long time. Tube feeding they did for folks that wouldn't eat, but it was not done a lot. There were a lot of risks with that. You can imagine if you started to vomit or somebody was really aggressive or agitated, you might cause a pneumonia if they vomited. And then the effects of the war. So that's what's coming up here. So September 1939, Canada declares war. And the provincial was right on top of it. Dr. Menzies had a plan. If they had to evacuate patients, they were going to. It was some of the stuff comes from the newspapers, right? So the idea was that he was going to, the folks from Moncton, if they needed to be returned, they would go to the almshouse up there if nobody could take them, and if they were really aggressive and there was no place to keep them in the almshouse, they'd go to jail. So there were plans in place, because if they felt that the residents of St. John were bombed, we know that didn't happen, but they didn't know at the time. So they, you know, that they would have an idea what to do. They felt they could accommodate about 150 people there at the hospital. And they also had plans for staff had to be prepared, to have the clothes laid out. The blackouts were in place, what to do, where to go if there was a blackout or there was something that was bombing, where to take the patients to. It was felt the hospital was fireproof, so it shouldn't be an issue if they were bombed. It was very optimistic thinking. And the picture on the left, you can see that's from an annual report, and that was the number of, those were all the staff that were at the war. So there were 3 or 4 doctors there that had gone to the war. There were 3 or 4 nurses that had gone. And as Dr. Menzies said, we started to lose nurses at an alarming rate. Doctors were very hard to procure. Dr. Menzies started knocking on people's doors. You're a nurse, will you come and work? They were supposed to not be married. And if they were married, they had to have money to look after themselves. And they were supposed to work 12-hour shifts, but he was willing to take anybody, even for, I suppose, a morning. Would you come? but he couldn't get anybody. The Medical Council of New Brunswick at that time passed a regulation that they would not accept applications from new doctors, that they wanted to preserve the practices of doctors who'd gone away to the war. So when they came back, they didn't have to restart and get new patients all over again, which you can see would be a problem if you wanted to put somebody in place to look after the patients of the doctors that went to war. And then in 1942, Lois Smith, who was the director of nursing, superintendent of nurses, and she played a very important role as well there. She left to go to the University of Toronto. So he was losing staff like crazy. Because of the war, there were also issues with linen. They were getting messages that they would have less linen. Food was rationed. There was a big drop. I think I read something, like tons of sugar were reduced. They used to add it. People could add their own sugar to the porridge in the morning, but they weren't allowed to anymore. People complained about the taste of the pudding. And they rationed metal as well. Initially, at the beginning of the war, there were armed guards on top of the hospital, 15 or 16 of them. And they were also guards on the bridge because they weren't sure whether saboteurs would come in and damage the reverse impulse bridge. But that didn't last long. That was really only about a month or so. Unfortunately, a patient at the Annex building, so the Annex had been built around 1870. I think I mentioned this earlier, down around where the Dr. Roberts School is, and it was for quiet patients that, that was going to be their home. Certainly not all worked in the fields with the growing vegetables and things, but one of them wandered. And he must have gone into a restricted area, and he didn't heed their calls to halt, so they shot him. And then there was this huge, there was a report in the newspaper back and forth about how they had struggled to get a physician on call to come over to the Centre Care Provincial to do the surgery, because there was a surgical unit there. And it was back and forth, can't reach it, who's on call, and finally they did reach somebody. And the anesthetist actually had to put his equipment in the hospital, take a taxi over to the hospital with his equipment. And the poor person was operated on but died the next day. And then there were prisoners of war there at the hospitals. I have some numbers here. Prisoners of war, there were, well, first of all, there were criminals there. And there was a story in the newspaper about 2 that had escaped. One of them was in jail for 14 years. They never said what he had done, but he was there. There were 5 prisoners of war. There was an article about a Finnish prisoner had escaped. One-eyed, wearing a blue and white striped jacket, had escaped. Imagine whether the poor fellow could speak English, running around New Brunswick or St. John. And he had escaped from the hospital. There were 22 active force members there at the hospital, 6 sailors, and 18 from World War I. So they had to contend with that as well. So this just kind of shows you some of the staff budget and actual numbers in 1945. So the ward supervisors, 13 were supposed to be there, but they only had 7. If you look at the big one is the male attendants, ward attendants, male at bottom row. They were budgeted for 32 and they had 17. So they were really understaffed. And the next slide shows the female population. So on the female side of the building, it was the wards were all lettered. A, B, C, D, Ward A, B, C. And then on the male side, which is what we're going to talk about specifically, they were numbered. And we're going to talk about Ward 2. So Ward 2 was the receiving ward. They had disturbed, violent patients from other wards. They had criminals. They had, it was the admission ward. So DT, somebody going through the DTs, which is actually a very critical illness. I mean, people die from DTs if they're not treated, were admitted to this ward. They were supposed to have a capacity for 80 patients, but they would have anywhere from 100 to 115 at any time. There were 4 staff attendants, but Often they had 12-hour shift, but they'd have a 2-hour break in the day. So you'd lose somebody that way. It might be somebody's morning off. So anytime there could be 3 or even 2 staff on working, you can imagine for 115 patients. A lot of the patients went to the cafeteria, and there was a lot of restraint use. It says considerable. So I found this blueprint of Ward 2. So they'll talk about, they'll call it Ward 2, but it actually had several components. It had a short hall, which I'm assuming is that smaller rectangle there. I couldn't read it very well. They had a long hall, which they didn't spend much time on for some reason. I don't know. They seemed to spend their day and their nights on the short hall. And they'd have cots down, and they would, when the day came, they'd stack the cots all up at the end of the ward, and then people would sit on benches for the day. Sometimes it was so congested, people had a hard time finding a place to sit. And then they put the cots down at night. And Rika, I hope you don't mind if I tell the story you told me. Rika Block was telling me how in the 80s she worked there as a student, and there were people there from the 20 years or even more before, and the beds were so tightly packed that in order to get from one side of the ward to the other, they would walk on the ends of the beds. So congested. So they would say that sometimes the folks that were there were really difficult patients to manage. They also had an unused above. There was a ward above that had been renovated but wasn't being used. I don't know why. And then they had what's called the old attic, and I'll talk about the old attic here. The head attendant was Harry Cunningham, and he'd been there a long time. And he had a very simple way of talking and understanding, and he talked in circles when you read the transcripts. But he was in charge, and he set the tone for the ward. And he was quoted as saying, "Patients of this type are very cunning, and they know a lot more than you think they do. I call them cute." Which doesn't really lend itself to thinking the person's very understanding. And he would say he would spend most of his time in his office, but he would have up to 38 dressings to do a day. And they would have certain days of the week for everybody to get a bath, certain day of the week people got shaved. So he used to brag he could shave somebody in a minute, And then there was a group of young patients. They were called the Wolves. They used to be called themselves the Friendly Gang or something, but then they renamed themselves the Wolves. 8 patients, young men. The oldest might have been 25. Some of them had been there for years. There was one that I think it was either he was 6 or 9 when he was moved to the hospital. And he was about 18 at the time. So he spent 2/3 of his life there as a patient. And they could be very helpful for the attendants, but they could also be aggressive, violent, steal from them. So it was not great to have them being put in charge of patients, but it was not unusual for the attendant to hand him the key, one of the wolves, hand him the key, and then have him go around and unlock the other patients who were restrained. So this is what he wrote about the old attic. The old attic consists of 2 large rooms, a smaller room, an antechamber, and a toilet. The 2 larger rooms contain about 14 beds each, and there are 3 beds in the smaller room and another bed in the antechamber. The place is unheated, the walls are filthy, a curious slime covers the floor, and rat holes are everywhere. I counted 8 beds that possessed woolen blankets. The rest were equipped with 1 cotton undersheet and 1 thin flannelette sheet. 3 of the patients were ankle strapped to their cots. The door to the small room was locked, and the door to the stairway was locked as Sid Phillips and I left the patients to their dreams. During the 8 winter days that I spent at the hospital, it was a constant source of amazement to me that no one collapsed of exposure in the old attic. So they called the commission, and they had some very good choices. I don't know if you know much about Judge Baxter. He was a premier at one point. When I read his story, it was fascinating. He was like, his father abandoned him and his mother when he was about 2. They didn't have social assistance back then, so she relied on her family to support them or help them. And he
decided he wanted to, he says he lost his first two jobs, one for incompetence and the other one for insubordination. And then he ended up working in a lawyer's office, decided to be a lawyer. And then from there, he decided to run for city council on the west side. So he was city councilor at 24. And then he went on to be the premier, the attorney general. He was he went into federal politics and was a minister in the government for the federal. So he was the head of the Law Society, head of Boy Scouts, I think it was, head of some militia unit. He did very well. And he was called to be the head of the commission, the chairman. The other one was Mr. Sweeney. I never did learn what the E stood for. He was the manager of the Admiral Beatty Hotel, but he also was the head of the chair of the commission or committee at the St. John General, which was responsible for kind of managing and controlling that hospital. And then Reverend Pepperdine was an Anglican minister at St. Luke's Church, and he was a judge for the youth court, juvenile court. So those were the commissioners that were to head up this inquiry. Other key factors, Dr. Sullivan was, I think he must have retired and then came back when the war started. He worked on the medical units at the hospital, the center care. Dr. Fisher was a Jewish man who barely got out of Nazi Germany. He lost both his mom in a concentration camp and his mother-in-law on a cattle car. But he and his wife and daughter got out. He couldn't get a job in Canada. They had a family member in Montreal, so he stayed with, he must have met Dr. Menzies because he got on to work with Dr. Penfield, kind of just be a part, Dr. Spellberg toast that Penfield he must have introduced him to Dr. Menzies, I guess. There's not really clear how they met. And Dr. Menzies got him to come to St. John as an intern. But he had been working in the court in Silesia, which is kind of part of Germany, Poland, in that area. So he was a qualified psychiatrist. And they were escaping Nazi Germany. He had hidden newspaper articles in his luggage. And they only got out because somebody told them to get off that car and get onto another train car because they were pulled off at the border. Anyways, he ended up in St. John without his family. At one point, the RCMP confiscated his camera, thought he was taking pictures. The government, people in the medical society did not accept him well at all. And there were articles talking about him being Hitler's spy. But the premier stood up and defended him in the legislature. So the IODE got involved, which is ironic because Dr. Menzies' wife was a member of the IODE, but they wanted to know why he was hired. They wanted an investigation. Anyways, he was there. Dr. Gallant was a francophone doctor. Fred Burnell was the chief attendant, and he'd been at the hospital for many, many years. Mr. Cunningham we mentioned, and then the wolves. So those are the other kind of key characters in the story. So the inquiry was held. They had 60 witnesses. It was over several days, long sessions, some of them. And they called everybody from the veterinarian to the engineer for the hospital to Brennan, Brennan's funeral home. Well, Mr. Brennan came in to give evidence to show if there was any evidence or abuse, anything he'd ever noticed. And it was held at the assembly room at the old bill, at the provincial, and they were pretty well full for most sessions. There was a lot of interest. They investigated the deaths that were reported. So there were 4 deaths that they investigated. One was, there was somebody had written to Johnstone, after it all came to light in the newspaper about she had worked there, she had seen terrible things. A young person came in and had died 8 days later, bruises and things. So his death was investigated. Turned out he died several weeks later, and nobody had seen any evidence of abuse. There was another one who, Letany, the young attendant, had gone and reported his death, and they had called many people ask them the possibility. It turned out he had died. If he had syphilis and it went to the brain, it was called general paresis of the insane. And, you know, Letney had thought that he had a broken neck. And he had taken this diagram of a body with bruises and marks on it. He also had requested, there was another patient there who was a doctor, and he was involved in some of this reporting and things. And he was taken, they had, he and a couple, this other, you will hear about this, John Drummond, but they went to, in the middle of the night with Letney and Francis Hines, somehow they got the keys, the two attendants and two patients went down to the morgue, opened it up, took a body out of its basket, and were marking on their paper where they saw marks on the body. So, and he took that to the standard, Letney did. So they investigated that, and they didn't find any evidence of abuse. There was another patient who died while the inquiry was going on. Nothing was found there. And then the other one, let me just see, was a young Acadian. And it was reported in the Standard magazine because Johnston talked about him being beaten up by one of the wolves. Anyways, they didn't find any evidence that he had died because of the injuries. They investigated, you know, the food. They'd had supposedly oatmeal for 40 years every morning. They investigated complaints of bed bugs, rats, cockroaches. They looked at the infrastructure. There was quite an interesting, between the lawyers, they had this little, and a doctor, a little contest to see who could, there was a report missing that medicine was missing, the morphine combination. 32 applications should have been in the bottle, and there were only 12 written off. So what happened to the other 20? So they had this at the inquiry, they had a little competition to see who could waste the least. I guess it caused some amusement for the people there. Anyways, I think it was the lawyer one. There was abuse. They looked at abuse and neglect. They looked at staffing. They looked at, there wasn't one of the attendants that went, I'll tell you a little bit more about him, but he went to the Standard. It was Letney. He was brought back as a witness. He actually, at that point, was a patient at the General Hospital under an incognito. And turned out he was one of the abusers. He would strap patients tie them with their hands to the bed and their legs to the bed and leave them there for hours on end. So, and then he ends up, just to spoil the story a little bit, he ends up back as a patient himself in the hospital. And then and the other one is John Drummond. John Drummond was, there's nothing about him in the, he was involved, he was counseling the young attendants what to do. He was a patient, but you really don't know who he was. He wasn't called as a witness. So he was involved in them going to the morgue to see what was happening, you know, with his body. He had counseled them to go to the Standard magazine. So he would serve them their suppers, and he'd get in on their conversations and kind of advise these young attendants what to do. The other thing I didn't mention was Francis Hines had gone to the CCF, political party, had gone to Moncton and brought back this woman who was part of the CCF, and she had stayed in John Drummond's room and Francis Hines' room for the night. They wanted a tour of the hospital. So they were having these tours for this person. She left the next morning and nothing was ever reported or done from what I could see. I did look at the CCF records, but I didn't find anything that talked about it. The province also brought in Dr. Bonner from Denver in the United States, and he was going to do a big review of the hospital. Other things going on during the story. So this happened. Maxwell Singer was a very probably brilliant young man, had born in Russia, had gone to McGill Law, and he had led his class in second year. In the third year, he got very sick. They don't say what from. He didn't finish, but they gave him his degree. He won scholarships to the Sorbonne. He was, I don't know how much he practiced in France, but he was there. He also came back to Quebec, and he had a practice there, but things started to fall apart. He was claiming that these companies were committing fraud. He ended up being charged with practicing without a license. He absconded from the country. He was writing letters to his family saying he was getting people into the United States for money. And in the end, he was extorting his family for money, like thousands of dollars. And then he was threatening them. So there was one letter that he had them, he wrote to his family wanting money. The father tore it up, the letter up, sent the money back, or the letter back. Then he wrote them a letter, said, I got the letter, and then he charged them with stealing the letter. So he ends up in court, and who does he meet there? But Dr. Menzies is called in because he refuses a psychiatric assessment. But he ends up having, Dr. Menzies is there, says, you know, given the risk with this man, he should be at Centricare or at the provincial. He ends up there against his will, and then he starts this process of getting out. And he starts to smuggle documents, legal documents, out of the hospital in books and things so that he can get to the Supreme Court of Canada. And John Crankshaw, it was a couple years behind him at McGill, but was somebody that helped him. He was his lawyer on the outside. And ends up that Crankshaw's at the Supreme Court of Canada. It's a very embarrassing thing. He practically runs out, tearing his clothes off, you know, he's all upset because the case had been told it wasn't supposed to be there. It was really up to the fact that he was deemed mentally ill, and he refused, but he was deemed as a risk, and he refused to have an assessment. So poor Max was kind of behind the scenes here, and there were letters during the inquiry back and forth between Crankshaw and Singer, where Crankshaw, the outside lawyer, was talking about how Mr. Sweeney, the head of the Admiral Beatty, also one of the commissioners, was wiretapping the letters or the conversations between the Standard people, the editor and Ken Johnstone. So that, and you know, that all got blown up into a big thing, and they wanted, Baxter wanted to be sure there was nothing that would compromise the commission. So it ended up that Crankshaw never did issue an apology. They found no evidence. Johnstone, the editor, Glenn Gilbert, and Mr. O'Connell, who owned the Standard, all sent letters and affidavits saying it was not wiretapped. They didn't believe it was. The other thing going on in the background was Clarence Hinks. He was the head of the Canadian National Committee for Mental Hygiene, known today as the Canadian Mental Health Association. And he was writing letters to the provincial hygiene guy, who was the head of Mount A. And they were saying this is a perfect time to try and get some changes done at the provincial. And then they were writing to the Premier, McNair. But then McNair, there was a difference in what Ken Johnston was saying, whether or not Hinks had told him to go ahead and publish the letters, because Johnston had gone to Hinks for information on mental health and with an idea we're going to publish these letters. So he's saying that Johnstone at the inquiry said that Hinks told him to publish, and Hinks was writing saying we didn't tell him to publish. There was this difference. So Baxter wanted to sort that out. The Premier was afraid that there was something they were trying to embarrass the province into doing something. So that was also going on in the background. So they had the big investigation, lots of questions asked. We talked about the deaths. They didn't find that there were anybody to blame for the deaths. There was lots of issues they did see in the building that they needed changes. The old attic was terrible. But there were other things that came out. So the Hines brothers, turns out they weren't brothers at all. Francis had been the assistant superintendent of a boys' home in Toronto. And he had left with 2 or 3 boys. It's a boys' working home. And gone to Niagara Falls, but then had car trouble, so didn't get back. So I think he felt he was going to be punished for not getting back. So he takes off with the younger Kenneth Hines, who was one of the boys in the working home. They ended up in St. John, got the jobs. Turns out Kenneth's name was really Kenneth Stewart. Whether or not his dad was a doctor was never really clear, but there was mention of that. Anyway, so that just came out just before the inquiry. So you can imagine the Standard finding out that some of their people they're relying on their stories for aren't even telling the truth to them. Ernest Letney, we mentioned, he ended up as a patient back in the hospital. Ironically, he ends up meeting with Singer, who tries to start sending letters to the superintendent about why he should not be there. He didn't have the right to put Letney in the hospital. And poor Mr. Letney, he ended up it just caused chaos. If it's the same Letney, he was charged with, I think, trying to commit suicide in Ontario. He ended up on the West Coast at one point, and they thought that he was so confused, they thought he'd been on a ship that had been torpedoed by the Japanese. He ended up in the States, and he was deported at least once. He was in a couple psych hospitals down there. He claimed that his wife, this 4'2" little lady, had been kidnapped, and it sounds like in the newspapers that they just had a disagreement and she left him and let him, Anyways, it was all kinds of drama around this fella, and the poor fella ends up dying about 32, at 32. But because of the timing, you can get his medical records that are held in the archives, and you can read all kinds of interesting stuff about this fella. And Maxwell Singer, he died in the 50s. For anybody in healthcare, it was interesting looking at his health record, because I could get that too. His blood pressure was through the roof for years and years, and nothing was ever done about it. Then he died of heart failure. John Drummond, I think who he was, and I think this might explain why he was never called. So it's kind of tricky. There was a John Drummond born in one little community, and then there's a birth certificate for him. There is a World War I record for John Drummond identifying the community almost next door to it. So is it the same guy, the same birthday, but there was 1 year apart? So whether that was just an error in recording. And there was also different mothers. His mother had TB and would have died when he was about 3. So maybe he didn't even know he had a different mother. It's the same dad for both of these fellas. If it's 2 guys and 1 guy, just some misrecording. And then the thing is, there's a letter. John Drummond sent a poem that he wrote to the town council of Woodstock, and it's really quite creative. And it mentions Menzies and Cunningham and all these patients that died. Anyways, and the signature on the bottom of it matches a signature of a John Drummond who was First World War, and that John Drummond had had a head injury in the war. He was hit with shrapnel, and it recorded that he was excitable. So maybe that's why he was never called. This guy who seemed to orchestrate things behind the scenes. Maybe he was fine one-on-one, but something like the inquiry would have just really tipped his mental health off. There was an article in the New York Times in 1970 or so about John Drummond from New Brunswick, First World War vet, who was following spiritualism and was redoing this cottage where some ghost had appeared years before. So obviously he didn't stay at the Provincial. And he actually gave the John Drummond from up that way, gave his house to use for the public libraries. So we might be here in part because of John Drummond's donation in some way, contributing to the system. And then Ken Johnson, turns out he was a Trotskyist, which was illegal in Canada. He had spent a week in Norway with Leon Trotsky, the famous communist guy. He never told anybody. And he used to write for the communist magazines and newspapers in Canada and in England. He got beat up as well in Berlin because he didn't salute the Nazi flag. So overall, what did they find from the Royal Commission? Care and treatment are good in every department of the institution. Remember, we're only talking about Ward 2, though. Ward 2, which was, the other parts might have been just fine. Due to the shortage of experienced medical assistants and other competent help, the number of patients under treatment of one kind or another is down to a minimum. The wards are clean and neat, and order and discipline are well maintained. The condition is especially true on the women's side and is the rule rather than the exception on the men's side. Ward 2 and 5 are the only two that really need immediate attention to relieve overcrowding and allow segregation so that active types will not retard the care of other types. So out of the commission came the recommendations. One, ward wage increases. And right across the board, they were increasing wages, trying to recruit folks to come and work, including the physicians. There was physical and chemical. They had recommendations around who's restrained, recording when they're restrained, only when it's ordered by a doctor. Or I think it was the head attendant or the registered nurse could order that. And chemical strength, how to use that as well. They recommended a francophone hospital, or they said another building, because remember they had about 400 extra patients, so another building at the annex site. But they really recognized that the francophone population needed to have its own hospital. Veterans and children and other groups of patients, they wanted to move the veterans out to the veterans hospital. Children should have their own hospital. Other groups of patients, like those that are delirious, those that have DT, should not be treated there, should have their own facilities. That the mortuary facility and the postmortems, so mortuary, the morgue was not in good shape. It wasn't chilled. So in one case, somebody had been there a couple of days before the family came, got them and drove them in their car to northern New Brunswick. Yeah, and then they wondered why there were marks on the body. Postmortems, anybody that they wondered about, any kind of, questionable deaths, that they'd be able to do it appropriately there. There was a postmortem done on one of the patients, but they had to move the body to the St. John General because the facilities were better there. They wanted definitely increased staff, an OT department. They had nothing for the patients. They'd sit there all day long on benches, if they couldn't do any of the little chores. Although there were a lot of patients doing things around the hospital. They had to fire the coal to keep the place warm. They were working on farms. They were working in the laundry. There was a sewing section. So there were certainly, but not all. They need lots of renovations. They recommended a board of governors. So that would be not to tell Dr. Menzies, but to be getting information and advocating to the province for him. And then they talked about improved communication. They also wanted some of the weight to be taken off of Dr. Menzies. So he wasn't responsible for the renovations and trying to decide where the money went to and all kinds of stuff that was left to him, management of the annex, He also, Dr. Menzies also was doing care outside. Like he was, for some of it, he was at a trial when some of this stuff was going down in northern New Brunswick, in Dalhousie. Like there were only a couple psychiatrists in the province, and he was one of them, being called away to do things like that. And then improved communication. So they'd have sit down and have meetings, and they talk about patients, and they talk about what was going on in different departments. I'm almost done. Other events and themes, there was certainly politics behind in all of this. You get the PCs arguing with the Liberals about who was spending what, who was giving patronage to what department for the hospital, and then why something wasn't being done and how embarrassing we are. And there was really an inefficient process for change, but it seemed like that a lot of notes had to be, if they wanted to increase the wages of the fellow who was looking after the laundry, they had to send a note to the provincial government to get permission. So you can imagine how that slowed things down. I wanted to just mention how stuff was spread across the country. You could get access to newspapers from Edmonton and Calgary, Ottawa, that were all talking about this. This was a big deal. And my dear Aunt Marie, who died a couple of years ago, she said, she was 16, about that age at the time, she said it was a big deal here at St. John. And when they did come out with the final, it was the front page of the Telegraph Journal was nothing but the commission. And there were other pages as well. The CBC, I didn't mention that. CBC was going to interview Ken Johnstone about the whole thing. And then at the last minute, it was canceled. And it was a minister for something with the war. I could pull it up, but I won't take any more time doing that. But anyways, LaFlèche, his name was. And he called and told the CBC not to put it on. And the CBC came back and said, no, we already decided not to put it on. But, you know, somebody standing in for McNair, the premier, had called the federal to get this all originated and shut down. So, again, you know, there was an outcry against the government interfering with the CBC. And then I guess the other thing that really hit me was the interconnectedness of the people. I mean, Baxter was at one point involved in a trial for Singer, whether or not he should be admitted. And then here he is at the commission, and then here is Baxter's lawyer, you know, making accusations about wiretapping at the Admiral Beatty. So, or not Baxter's lawyer, sorry, Singer's lawyer. So you can see where Menzies went to Singer's appointment at the courthouse, you know, to make a declaration about this man's sanity. There was a lot of interconnectedness around these folks. And one of the things Dr. Menzies said was that even hiring attendants, that they knew somebody or knew somebody who knew somebody, whether or not this person should be hired. And that these three, Letney and the two Hines, were actually the first they'd ever hired from outside of New Brunswick, that somebody didn't know this person or didn't know the Letney or the Hines. Stigma was another kind of issue that was really evident. So this was I don't know whether this was a lawyer, the family from Bathurst of one of the patients that died and was investigated had the same name as an article that was written. And I can do the French, or I'll just quickly skip to the English part if you need it, if it's okay. Philippe Bigard goes to his office, returns immediately, and gave poor Paul an injection of soothing syrup in the lingo of the Gestapo agents of Faribault. So, yeah, you can imagine how that feeds stigma. If you even against the attendants, you know, they're not people trying to help, they're Gestapo. And then the confidentiality. I think that was pretty well the last. The confidentiality, there was an article that was reporting on one of the deaths, so-and-so had died of syphilis. Here's his name, this is where he's from. And there was another article that was saying so-and-so is in, and these are his parents up in this community. Like, no privacy. It was just shocking by today's standards. And then just today, just recently there was a legal thing came down about folks. So the Francophone Hospital in Campbellton, $17 million that came out against abuse against the residents, neglect, inadequate care over a period of time. So it's still with us today, the challenges. There is a law now that people can report whistleblow confidentially on government, but in this case, this ombud, it was an anonymous letter that was sent to their office that started this study. I would just, also talk about stakeholders. So we have folks that are advocating for mental health, but and making policies and judgment, and some of them are very well educated and know the population, but some don't. And it's important to ensure that folks that are making these decisions have an understanding of the illnesses and all the issues involved. And then I guess I was going to end with, what are your thoughts? And just some acknowledgement, some wonderful support from lots of people. Yeah. All right. That's it.
We have time for questions and comments, and I'll just let Emery handle your own crowd. And I don't think they're going to kick us out of here. We have it booked till 2:30, but I don't think they'll give us the bum's rush in 15 minutes. But please, if you have some questions and comments, I'm going to shut up because I'm an academic. I go on, so please ask some questions and comments, and you can handle your own traffic.
When you were talking at one point, it was recommended to build a children's facility.
Yes.
How young were patients? Is there any information about how young
Well,
the youngest patients were?
The youngest I heard mentioned was 6. And I was reading about kind of, orphaned kids, kids that were, maybe troublesome in the home. Parents didn't know what to do, so they would drop them off. And there was a working school for boys on the east side, but if they were full, where would they put these children? Yeah, they also had these, forgive the language, idiots, imbeciles, and morons is what they called them, based on their cognitive capacity. And they would say, well, I forget whether the idiot is the, 0 to 3 mentality, and then 3 to 9 would be the imbecile. And then morons were, adults that never really went past very, young child development, or child development. Yeah. Yeah.
Emery, a lot of your research looks like it's driven from historical documents.
Yeah.
I wonder if you have a feel for how much living history is still available in terms of people who worked at the institution and people who were clients. Do you have a feel for how much?
No, but I thought that would be another bunch of great studies. I know Lois Smith, I mentioned 1934, she was brought as a nurse to the hospital. There is an audio recording of her. The Nurses Association had it, some of her recordings. So she was also, I think, the head of the Nursing Association at one point in New Brunswick. But yeah, I haven't seen a lot, and we're losing some of those folks. Yeah. But there's some here today that worked there, so back before it was closed. Yes.
I recall, and maybe other people recall, I think it was the 1970s, David Camp did a series of articles on the provincial hospital.
Okay.
Did you come upon that, or did anybody?
No, I didn't.
I just remember as a younger person reading about that, and terrible things were happening at the provincial hospital then.
Yeah.
And he wrote about phlebotomies and
right. Yes, they did them there,
yeah.
But it wasn't until I think the 50s that they started them, and they've been proven to be not good. Yeah. And that's part of the issue. Some of these illnesses are really devastating, really in terms of people's thoughts, their emotions, their behaviors. And back then, they wouldn't have had the medicines that we have today. The medicines we have today are so helpful, so wonderful. They're not perfect. But then sometimes what happens with the illness is a person can even think that they're getting better, they don't need them anymore, and then they slip back into the illness. And I think we still hear stories about awful things happening because somebody is ill, and that rises the whole ethical debate about how do we help these folks. And some folks would just say, well, they're always going to be dangerous, they're dangerous, and that's all there is to it. And then others would try and find another strategy to help them.
Does anyone else remember those articles? I know we can't access the teleprompter
I know.
archives now.
That's so
You
frustrating.
can't have microfilm upstairs.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. That was so great.
I did see, I forget whether it was the New Brunswick Genealogical Society that said that the records that were originally the Telegraph Journal records that we could access are now on newspapers.com. So you have to have
A subscription.
You have to have a subscription to that, but the records are
there?
apparently now there.
Yeah. Yeah, I wrote them. I've been writing them saying, why can't we have them back? And that's what they say. Newspapers.com.
Yeah, very useful.
Yeah.
Is there a list anywhere of the staff, like the nurses that would have worked there in the late 40s and 50s?
Yeah, I don't know of any. I know that in the transcripts, which are all available at the right now closed museum, but word for word, it's fascinating. You really get a sense of the personalities when you're reading the transcripts and the people involved. But they're all available there. And they did interview a lot of the nurses that were there. But yeah, I've not seen a list.
My grandmother worked there, and she died before I was born, but she did work there in
Yeah.
the late 40s, early 1950s. But my dad said she was a matron.
What was her name?
Madeline Hardy.
Okay, I don't remember seeing that name. Yeah.
Dad said she used to, one of the things that she used to do before she went to work was mend, like she'd mend his socks or his, whatever, that was what she would do before she went to work. And Dad said she would sit and mend and cry because she didn't want to. She was so upset at having to go to work that she would sit and mend his clothes.
She didn't want to go to work?
No, she was so upset at what was
happening
there, or just maybe their condition, or maybe just dealing with their mental health issues.
Yeah.
But she would sit, Dad said, the hour before she went to work and mend his clothes and cry, and that was sort of her outlet. And then she would go with it.
Yeah.
I'm a nurse, and I work at Centre Care now.
Are you Katrina?
I am.
Oh, okay, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. Yeah, I've been there for 12 years, and I know what resources I have now and what medicines we have now, and over the 12 years, even that's improved in the years I've been there. I can't even fathom not having medications.
Yeah.
I speak to students that come and do a little clinical rotation at our building, and they're always amazed. We have 3 different units at Centre Care for anyone that doesn't know the layout. One is a complex behavior, one is psychogeriatric, the other is rehab. And I always ask students at the end of the day, you've met some of our clients, some are more complex than others, some present really great, like it's all very different. Now take away all their medications, what would you do? Because we talk about the history of Centre Care and Provincial Hospital and what was done in the past.
Yes.
I very much believe they did do the best they could with what they had,
Yes.
which was very little when you look at the documents. I've read every single superintendent report for the provincial hospital, and every year it was the same sort of, we've made this improvement and we're going to try this, like the insulin therapy and all that kind of stuff. Like it was all very steps forward every single time. Even though we tried it and it didn't work, we're going to move on to something else. Like it's always been a continuum,
Yeah.
and it continues to be that, even in the time that I've been a nurse in mental health. And I'm excited to see what the future brings because it's ever improving. So I think, in the 40s, I would have cried too before I went to work because I can't even imagine how that was for someone.
Yeah.
Trying to provide care with no resources.
Well, Pepperdine commented at the inquiry about how they had done, the commissioners would go into the hospital unannounced. That was part of the inquiry process. And comments about going onto a ward and a young nurse or attendant having her hair pulled out. They didn't comment in the newspaper. They made the comment about how he said she was a plucky young woman. They didn't comment about the hair, So rough.
I'm curious, I haven't read any of the documents. I'm excited to read your book. I'm curious if any patients were included and if their perspectives were also included within the commission.
They were. Yes, actually, it was Mr. Sweeney that wanted to hear the patient's perspectives. And they got several interviewed. At one point, they walked, the commissioners and the reporters, they didn't let the public go, but they walked through the hospital, through several wards, doors locking and unlocking behind them, to interview one of the attendants, because they would also, attendant who got sick might be on the ward, on the hospital unit. So they went to interview him, but they did interview different patients, yeah.
Anne-Marie, you've worked as a health professional, mental health professional, and thank you and to others who are doing the same thing or have done. But I'm wondering, now that you are looking just recently back on your career, in that area, knowing that we're in an election provincially,
Oh.
where health is a big issue with
Yes.
all the parties, mental health is part of that. Would you have any wise counsel to pass on to people who are running for office to help both in the community and in our schools and post-secondary?
Well, if I can quote a very wise person that I worked with, said, mental health is the golden thread that links health together. So wherever you go in the hospital, you're going to find, or in the community, you're going to find mental health issues. And we really have to focus on it. It has to be a priority because that's how you build a healthy society. Is if you have folks that are, you know, feeling well at their best.
I guess I spoke too soon because we're getting chased up by a cello and a violin. Really, we don't have to leave though, but I think the formal part of the afternoon is over. It's very fascinating. I have tons of questions myself, but hopefully the speaker will stay around and answer a few of those questions and maybe ask about the book. I know the book is a little
Yeah, I brought a copy. It's published by a company called Nova, which is a textbook publisher. I couldn't find anybody local.
Yeah.
And as a result, I was fortunate to find somebody. But it's quite pricey.
I think if you put pressure on the public library to buy copies, I think UNB has a couple copies, don't they?
Yes, UNB has copies.
So it's a St. John story. There's people literally related to people in the book. So put pressure on your library to buy those copies. And, yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, you go.
Or the series?
You go straight to Netflix. Straight to Netflix. Anyway. Yeah. Let's thank our speaker. Please hang out.